Okay.
Professor. Oh, sorry. Hey, hi, how are you, Professor Allison?
Good. How are you, Sana?
Good. I was on mute. Is there anything that's due? Sorry. I've just been working a lot. And
Is there anything due?
yeah, like a paper wise.
Yeah, the 20-page research paper on the origins of the American Revolution with particular reference to the Puritan impact on the Revolution. That paper?
That's due.
No, actually, I was just making that up.
Oh, I was like dying right now. I was like,
Thank you for asking.
I'm like, oh, this is great.
Yeah, so
that was good.
No, to my knowledge, nothing is due.
So the thing I was like, I wasn't able to be in that class for the camera thing. What was that about? I know you gave us a tour of all the monuments. Was that part of the monument assignment?
Yes. So the next project you'll be doing, you're doing two projects now. One is on a eminent Bostonian, and most of you have received your contact information and should be working on that. And the other is on a monument. And so for that project, we have these cameras. So the first thing you'll do is identify a monument, do some research on it, and then go take 3D pictures with this camera. Yes.
Yeah.
How do you like claim a monument to like research?
You tell me you want to do that monument.
Yeah, I want to do the
Christmas. Spray paint your initials on it, and go claim the monument. You just go and let me know that's what you want to do. Okay.
Hey, so can I do the Christmas one that I sent you? The one I missed. The one was. Did you show the first monument? The one I missed, the Crispus attack or whatever.
The Crispus Attucks or the Boston Massacre monument. Yes, you may do that.
Okay, cool.
And
that was the first. That was the one you showed. The first one, right? That I missed.
I can't remember.
Oh, okay.
Professor.
Yes, sir.
Is it one monument for one person, or can multiple people do the same monument?
Different people can do the same monument.
Okay.
And I think, okay, let me get a sense from the class. Do you want to work with another person, or do you want to do this on your own?
I don't know. I don't have time to meet up with someone, so I can do this on my own.
Yeah.
Like the camera, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's gonna take a long time.
That's right. That part of it will take a long time. It might be useful to have someone else. Those of you who, why don't we, I hate to be indecisive. What do you think, Ahad?
I want to work on my own.
You want to work on your own. What about you, Seth? What about you, Henry?
Well, I prefer to work on my own. I don't know, like, so like, when is the project due?
We'll say the end of the semester.
Okay, all right, then.
So you will have time.
Okay.
So, you'll be doing it in steps up till the end of the semester. Okay, so, yeah, I didn't mean to have you do something so onerous no one would be able to do it. And you'll wind up, instead of this being fun and interesting, it becomes something you dread doing. And that's not what I was hoping would happen. Okay, let me just quickly make note of who is with us. Who's not. Okay. Okay, are there other questions?
Nope.
And where did we leave off last time?
At the park.
Okay, before the park.
Oh, that's the class I missed, so I'm not sure.
That was the class you missed.
We were talking about how they cut off all the agriculture from the countryside, so Boston was like running out of food.
When was this, Amber?
It was like only 3 of us showed up, So it was like after what happened in Concord
Yes,
and when
okay,
the soldiers came back to Boston.
okay, good. So essentially, as Amber just put it very well, actually, very succinctly, April of 1775, you have the British Army marching out to Concord to try to capture the weapons that are being stockpiled there, and then being pursued back into Boston by these various patriot militia. So at the end of the day, you have Boston occupied by the British Army. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. And the British fleet in the harbor. And then this countryside, essentially from Cambridge, from what is now Prospect Hill, it's now actually in Somerville, you know, here, down through Cambridge, you have the Army camping here, and then into Roxbury here, you have somewhere between 10 and 20,000 militia troops camping, holding the British in Boston. And then, as Amber said, since Boston always relied on these surrounding agricultural towns for food and firewood, and the islands in the harbor, like Noddle's Island here, were grazing areas for cattle and sheep and hogs, you have then an attempt by these militia forces to strip the islands of supplies so the British can't get them. And the British don't have firewood, they don't have fresh food, and so on. And so May of 1775, this is a view of, actually this is Boston. This is a nice shot of, you know, the town of Boston off in the distance from the heights in Charlestown, from Bunker Hill, looking toward Boston. And you have, okay, another map showing Noddle's Island, which is now East Boston, Noddle's Island and Hog Island. And this is the ferry at Chelsea, the Winnissiment Ferry. And in May of 1775, some of the militia troops go over to Noddle's Island, actually go by way of this way, and start driving the livestock off of Noddle's Island to prevent the livestock, the cattle, sheep, pigs, from being used to feed the British Army. And someone in the British camp spots this happening, because what happens is some of these guys light a fire that catches one of the barns on fire. People here in the north end of Boston see this, that is British sentries in the north end see this is what's happening, and they send a small ship, the Diana, up the Mystic River. This is the Mystic, this is Chelsea Creek, to try to stop the rebels from driving the livestock off of the island. A couple of things happen here. One, the rebels actually are pretty good. These are guys who know how to drive cattle, sheep, and hogs. So they've gotten most of them to Hog Island. A deployment of Marines comes ashore and tries to stop this engagement. They're fired on from the higher ground. And so you do have a series of battles on Noddle's Island. The other thing is the British do send a small sloop up the river, as I said, and from over in Cambridge, the Americans have produced one small cannon that they use to start firing at this British ship, and the British ship is firing back. The British ship is also trying to fire at these forces on Noddle's Island. The problem there is the ship is, of course, on the river. The guys driving the livestock are on top of a hill, and you can't really fire up from one of these warships. And then the Americans, as I said, bring a cannon over here and start firing. So the Diana drops down the river, starts firing at these this small fortification at Winnesimet Ferry. And what happens is they don't understand the tide as well as they should, and they wind up running aground. And then, of course, they are trapped there, and the Americans wind up capturing the ship. It's the first naval capture of what will become an 8-year-long war. And it forces the British no longer can get livestock from these surrounding islands. Okay. In one thing, any questions from here or the folks at home?
No.
Okay, thank you. So in February, the British government had decided to send more troops to Boston, thinking that if they just had a little more military support, they could put down this rebellion, which they thought was getting out of hand. And so they do send a bigger military force along with 3 new generals. And these generals arrive after the hostilities have broken out. And instead of finding that General Gage has things well in hand, they get to Boston and discover that it is actually surrounded by this army of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men. They don't know how many. That Gage and the British government really only control the town of Boston. And they only control as far as their military can reach. And so this is something of a problem, partly because they can't get any fresh supplies from the immediate area. So they have an army of between 8 and 10,000 men they have to feed, and they have horses, they have ships to maintain. Plus, by now there are about 1,000 people who want to remain loyal to the British Crown, who have come into Boston to be protected by them. And they don't have any real jurisdiction anywhere else. So this is a huge problem for the British, what to do about Boston. And one of the generals who arrives in May of 1775, John Burgoyne, he's also a playwright and well, an interesting guy. When Burgoyne is told, hey, Boston's now surrounded by 20,000 troops, he said, well, we'll just have to get a little elbow room. So the British do plan a campaign that will disperse this colonial militia. Or the militia is made up of all the men between the ages of 16 and 60. And essentially, they train 1 day a year, and they're supposed to be paid every day. And now they've essentially just been camping out, between Cambridge and Roxbury. And they're not a professional military force. The British have a professional military force. They don't know how many are in the American forces, but these aren't trained troops. And you put, thinking about, Seth and Henry here, who seem like they're good enough guys, but if they don't have any military training and suddenly they're facing someone who does, they're probably going to want to go home. And, and they're not going to do the things professional soldiers know they have to do. So the thinking is that what we will do, that is we, the British will do, is march over here to Charlestown and then go this way. And just the mere sight of a big British army coming is going to make most of these forces scatter. Think about it. Yeah, these guys, they had that action in April, and now they've just been camping out, which is kind of a fun thing, but suddenly it becomes a serious thing. You're going to want to go home. That's our thinking anyway. So the idea is we'll march over to Charlestown, bring about 2,000 or 3,000 guys to march this way. The end of the first day, they'll get to the area around Harvard, and disperse the rebels there. And then the next day, cross over to Roxbury, disperse the rebels there. And most of the guys might go home. What we do know is they're not going to be immediately around us will secure a wider area of British power, British control. So that's the idea on in June of 1775 for this campaign to get a little bit of elbow room for the British forces. Now, somehow word gets to the Americans that the British are planning a campaign like this. And also, you know, the Americans, neither side, I think we should keep reminding ourselves, is stupid. Each side is trying to anticipate what the other might do. And if you are on the American side, you know that the British have the capability of bringing, 1 second, I have to let a couple more people in. The British have the capability of landing troops. One thing you as Americans don't have are any boats, any ships, boats, or other things. The British do. So the British can control all of these waterways. And the British can bring troops up here to Charlestown. The town of Charlestown is here. And then behind Charlestown, there's a ridge of hills. The British can land troops here, go around the town and go this way. So one thing the Americans plan to do is build fortifications on these hills to prevent the British from doing that. And in fact, on June 16th, an American force led by Colonel William Prescott, they're sent, by the way, the commander of the American operation is General Artemus Ward. Ward is the commander of the Massachusetts military forces. Each colony has its own guy who is in charge of the colonial militia forces. He's appointed by the legislature or by the governor, and Ward is the guy here. He had experienced combat in the 7 Years' War, and here he is. You know, by the way, does anyone know how you become the senior commanding officer of a military force like this? Excuse me? You might have to win a conflict. That's certainly one thing. Do you think you have to be the best soldier who ever served? Seth's shaking his head. No, he doesn't. One thing you have to do is be senior to everybody else. That is, you have to have been in longer than everyone else, and that's what seniority means. And Ward is senior because he has been around longer than others. And sometimes seniority is a good thing. Sometimes it's not as good a thing. And Ward is the commander of the Massachusetts forces. I should say that Massachusetts' forces aren't the only ones here. There also are forces from New Hampshire and forces from Rhode Island. And what happens in this case is Ward sends Prescott. Let me see if I can erase this so it makes a little bit more sense. Okay, so Ward sends Prescott to fortify Bunker Hill, which is this one. And Prescott comes out to Bunker Hill and he looks and he sees that here there's another hill, Breed's Hill. He thinks, well, wouldn't it make more sense to fortify Breed's Hill, because that's the first one the British will be coming to. And so Prescott does move his men to Breed's Hill, and they spend the night digging fortifications here on Breed's Hill. Now, sometime after this, Ward sends Israel Putnam, another militia officer from Massachusetts, to reinforce Prescott. And Putnam gets out here and he says, what an idiot. That guy was sent to fortify this hill, but instead he's fortifying that one. So what Putnam does is start fortifying this hill. And these two guys, you know, Prescott doesn't really think it made sense to fortify that other hill. And this is actually, it's either one of the advantages or one of the great disadvantages the Americans have. Because these guys are both supposed to be obeying orders, but they get onto the scene, they see things aren't as their commander thought, so we will improvise. We'll do something different. And by the way, this is also something each of these soldiers serving under them will do. They will imagine how this could go better if we did this instead of that. It's not always, it's usually a disastrous thing. In this case, though, this is the character of these soldiers because they're used to deciding things on their own and not having General Ward giving orders that then have to be followed exactly. So you have these two different forces fortifying this hill. Now, I should say the day before, the British, anticipating that they were going to be marching this way, had sent a scouting party through Charlestown, through these hills, and there wasn't anything there. These guys had started fortifying the hills after dark on the 16th of June. And by early the next morning, they have dug in breastworks. That a breastwork is essentially a ditch that you can stand in and fire at anyone coming. And so each of these hills has on the top of it these breastworks and redoubts, that is further another kind of fortification on the top of this hill. Now the British, meanwhile, aren't aware of this. And so they send their forces over. Here's another view of this. This is a breastwork. See, these guys are standing in it, and the British start sending their forces over to Charlestown, and they start marching up this hill. And remember, these guys are anticipating that they're going to be now on the march all day, and they'll probably get to Harvard Square that night. Then the next day, they're going to march over to Roxbury. So they're planning a 3-day campaign, which means they're carrying everything they're going to need for 3 days. And it's a really hot, humid day in June. By the way, because they're going to be on the march for this long time, they spend the morning baking bread. I'm sorry, apparently you're not seeing the pictures. I apologize.
I'm just listening.
Do you see them now?
Yep.
Okay, so here is the breastwork. Here is Breed's Hill, Bunker Hill. The British land here. The British are baking bread, roasting meat, doing other things to provide for this 3-day campaign. And sometime afternoon, they start marching up the hill. It's actually several hours after noon. They're marching up the hill, hot, sultry day in June, and they get to the top of this hill, a hill their scouts had seen the day before, and there was nothing there. And suddenly this colonial militia force behind the breastwork starts shooting at them. And the muskets that these guys have are not particularly accurate. They wait till they're close enough that they actually can, pick them out. They are more accurate at a closer range. I should say the way the British fought would be to have the entire body march forward, fire a volley. That's going to do two things. One, it's going to make a lot of noise and also set up a huge cloud of smoke. And then they can reload in this smoke and march again and fire another volley. And in that time, maybe the enemy can shoot at them, maybe not. They may shoot another volley, but your purpose isn't to pick out individual guys. It's to set out a wall of lead. And then the other side might do the same thing. And what you as a British soldier are trained to do is use your bayonet. The shooting is just to create a smoke screen. And then the real thing you want to do is get the other guys to fire their weapons. And then in the time it's taking them to reload, you run at them with your bayonet, which is a much more lethal thing. So that was the British plan. But we're not actually expecting to do that till we get to Cambridge. Now we get to the top of this hill, and these guys are shooting at us. These guys we didn't know were there. And another thing the Americans are doing, the British find really devastating, is they're picking out the officers, because the Americans know the British soldiers rely on their officers to tell them what to do. And if the British soldiers don't have an officer telling them what to do, they won't know what to do. So just over the course of this revolution, or this war, that's going to go on for 8 years, 75 British officers die in combat. 25 of them die on June 17th of 1775. That is a third of the officers the British lose. They lose on this one day, as the Americans are picking them off. You can identify the officers because they wear nicer uniforms. They usually have gold on their epaulets, and they're the ones everyone is listening to. So you take out the officers, the men won't know what to do. So you have this devastating fire at the top of the hill, and the British forces retreat down to the bottom of the hill. And then they reconnoiter. They decide to make another assault. Now, meanwhile, while this is happening, over here in the north end of Boston at Copp's Hill, General Clinton is watching this happening, this British force marching up the hill, getting mowed down, retreating. He also sees that here from Charlestown, there are sharpshooters picking out the backs of the British ranks. So he has the warships in the harbor start firing on the town, actually sending fireballs into the town to burn it. So the British set fire to Charlestown. And so the next assault of the British forces up the hill, again, it's hot, it's humid, the day hasn't improved. Now you also have this fire in the town immediately behind you. It takes away the unpleasantness of having snipers shooting at you, but it causes its own problems. And now, of course, you're having to step over the bodies of the guys who got shot the last time you were going up the hill. And so they get to the top of the hill again, and the same thing happens. The forces at the top of the hill are able to stop them. They have to turn around again and go down to the bottom of the hill. Meanwhile, the British have also sent a force this way to land on the beach here along the Mystic River. And thus, we don't need to go through the troops on the top of Breed's Hill. We can go around them. Now here, I mentioned that Prescott and Putnam had arrived on the scene, and Putnam thought that Prescott had done the wrong thing by not fortifying the right hill. At this point, a third officer arrives, and this is John Stark from New Hampshire, and he's in command of a New Hampshire regiment. And he looks at this scene, and he can't believe that neither Prescott nor Putnam thought to try to fortify this area along the beach, because any idiot can see that this is where the British are going to attack. They can simply go around the fortifications you've built on the top of the hill. So Stark starts fortifying here, and it's actually here along the beach that you'll have the most casualties on both sides, because the British essentially are having to come through a relatively narrow area that Stark and his men have been able to fortify. And over here, by the way, on Copp's Hill, General Clinton is watching this, and he sees these three different American forces, which now are all fighting against the British, and he thinks this must be part of the American plan, that this must be a carefully coordinated strategy. Doesn't realize that this is actually because each of these guys thinks the other ones have really messed this up. And so this is now the third assault on Breed's Hill. The fighting going on down here at the beach. And also, this is the statue is of Colonel Prescott. And the portrait is Joseph Warren. Warren was the leading political figure in Massachusetts. He was the head of the provincial Congress and the head of the Committee of Safety. And he had received a commission to be a general in the Continental Army. Back in May, the Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, had decided to create a Continental Army out of all of these militia troops surrounding Boston, make them a Continental Army, and Congress also commissioned a number of officers to lead it. And one, of course, was Joseph Warren. Because he was an important political figure in Massachusetts, you should make him a general. The paperwork hadn't arrived yet. Warren, though, feels he should be at the scene of the battle. He arrives at the scene and he sees Colonel Prescott, and Prescott asks him, "Are you here to take command?" Knowing that Warren was a general, but Warren said, "The paperwork hasn't come through yet. I'm just here to be a volunteer, wherever I can do the most good." So Prescott sends him to the first redoubt on the very front lines of the force. Here you can see some more scenes of this. Here is Charlestown burning. Here are the British troops marching up the hill. Here are the Americans on the top of the hill, stopping them. This is the British frigate Somerset that is firing on the town. Another scene of Charlestown burning. And the Americans who are holding the top of the hill know the British are going to assault again. And they also know that the Americans don't have any more ammunition. So what do you do in a case like this? Yes.
Like, save your ammunition.
You do save your ammunition.
Get close and you can see the whites of their eyes.
Okay, there is the legend that Henry is reminding us of. We want to conserve our ammunition, so someone may have said, "Don't fire until you can see the whites of their eyes." That's how close you want them to be. I mean, we've known from the beginning that we're low on ammunition. And so you have to conserve it. But now at the end of the day, you're pretty much out of ammunition. And their main tool is their bayonet. So we in the first redoubt, where Joseph Warren is, are not going to be able to stop them. But what we have to do is hold them back long enough so that these other forces, Stark and Putnam, can get back to Cambridge so that they won't capture the entire army. That is, we can afford to give up this hill, which we probably can't hold, if we can get the rest of the army back to safety. What we have to do is save the army. I mean, physically, what we have to do is slow them down so the rest of the army can get away. You can probably imagine that even if you're a trained soldier, doing this is not going to be an easy thing, because what's the end for you? You're going to be, yeah. But this is what these guys know they have to do, which is, in fact, then what they do as they hold off the assault long enough that the rest of the army gets away. And this is a painting done much later by John Trumbull. Trumbull, an American artist. His father was the governor of Connecticut, and Trumbull actually served here. He was at Bunker Hill. This is not really an accurate depiction of what happened, because Trumbull is making the scene of this. As the British came over the redoubt, someone shot Warren, and here, this is Joseph Warren dying. The painting is called The Death of General Warren. And here you can see Lieutenant Pitcairn, or Major Pitcairn, a British officer who's been shot by this man, Peter Salem, who's an African-American in the one of the militia forces from Fitchburg, and Pitcairn is actually being caught by his son, who's a lieutenant. And so you have the death of Major Pitcairn and Joseph Warren at Bunker Hill, and the British do hold the hill at the end of the day. But remember, their objective had been to be in Cambridge at the end of the day and disperse the rebels. And in this battle, they have had something like 900 casualties out of about 2,000 or 3,000 men engaged. That is killed, wounded, or missing. Remember, every British soldier at this time has had to come here from across the ocean. And it's going to be hard to recruit more in England if it was easier to recruit when we didn't think the rebels could put up much of a fight. But now we see the rebels can put up a fight, and it's going to call into question in London whether or not we can sustain this war. So at the end of the day, the British hold the hill and will continue to hold it until they evacuate Boston. And the Americans, though, now still hold everything else. And this is the last time during the course of the war that the British will try to assault a position that the Americans have had time to enforce. General Howe says that these men built overnight what would take my men 3 months to build. There hadn't been any fortifications there the day before. Now the Americans are able to put up a fortification without any artillery that could still withstand 2 British assaults. So it's a lesson for both sides. For the Americans, it's a lesson that if we fight, we actually can defeat them. For the British, it's the same lesson, that if they fight, they actually can defeat us. Nathaniel Greene, an American officer from Rhode Island, says that he wishes we could sell them another hill at the same price. And General Howe notes that small armies like ours can't afford so many casualties. So this is what's happened. This is what happens at Bunker Hill. And here you can see a piece of propaganda that the Americans sent over the British lines from Prospect Hill in what's now Somerville to Bunkers Hill. Bunkers Hill is held by the British. It becomes their real base north of the town, and you can see what you get on each side. Okay, now meanwhile, we'll go back briefly, I think, to what's happening in Congress. As I said, Congress has decided to create a continental army. And part of the reason they won't do this is Massachusetts is very nervous about having this large group, or I should say large groups of armed men surrounding Boston. Because they're not going to listen to anyone. They, of course, are there doing us all a favor. And this isn't, well, I don't want to say anything disparaging about young men because there are many here in this particular class. But young guys who are away from their families, camping out, it's not really conducive to the kind of order and discipline you might like. And so Massachusetts has all of these militia troops surrounding Boston. By the way, and some are not from Massachusetts. The Rhode Islanders aren't going to listen to anyone from Massachusetts who gives them orders, nor are the guys from Connecticut or New Hampshire, which is why the Massachusetts wants someone else to take responsibility for these men. The someone else being the Congress. How about if Congress makes them into a continental army? Then that way, at least, we know someone will be in charge of it. So Congress in May of 1775 began debating what to do about this army. Remember, the president of the Congress is John Hancock. Very wealthy, young, engaging merchant from Boston, one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts, and also the commander of the First Corps of Cadets, a military unit here in Boston. And at the Congress, Hancock is the presiding officer. And it's Massachusetts that is pushing to have this motley collection of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 militia troops turned into an army. And fortunately, too, in Congress, Colonel George Washington from Virginia had arrived. And Washington, at least on one day, wore his uniform to the Congress. He said it was a sign that the time for talking was over and now was the time for fighting. Washington is on the committee in Congress to plan defenses of New York and also to plan for an army. He is someone with military experience from the 7 Years' War. Now, as Congress is discussing what to do about this army and creating a continental army, John Adams, also from Massachusetts, says that as we're discussing creating an army, we also need to discuss who will command the army. And I have someone in mind. Someone who is known and respected throughout the colonies. Someone who has military experience. And someone who has a large fortune. He is already committed to the cause. As Adams is speaking, John Hancock realizes there's really only one person Adams can be talking about. John Hancock. Hancock is known and respected throughout the colonies. After all, he is president of the Continental Congress. And Hancock, he has military experience. He's commander of the 1st Corps of Cadets. And who would be better to command a New England army than a New Englander like John Hancock? And a large fortune, already committed to the cause. Well, of course, so Hancock, by the way, only stands a little over 5 feet tall, but he's sitting up very tall in his chair as he hears John Adams talking about him as the commander of the Continental Army. On the other side of the room is sitting George Washington. And Washington begins to think, maybe he is talking about me. And Washington gets up and leaves the room. And just as Adams says, the person I have in mind is George Washington of Virginia. Washington leaves the room. Hancock's face freezes. He glares at Adams, and I'll never speak to John Adams again because he thinks he should have been the commander of the army. Washington, for his part, tells Patrick Henry later that day, "You may count on it, Mr. Henry. From this day, you may trace the ruin of my reputation." Washington knew how difficult this was going to be. First, to turn these 10 to 20,000 militia troops into an army, and second, to use it to defeat the most powerful military force in the world. But he does leave Congress. By the way, Washington also insists on serving without a salary. He does want Congress to cover his expenses. Congress does give him a second, and as I said, they make Joseph Warren a commander, and they also choose other officers, and one of them is this interesting thin man with the dog, whose name is Charles Lee. And Charles Lee was a British general. He had commanded British troops in Portugal during the 7 Years' War, and he had retired after the war. In fact, he was on half pay from the British Army. Washington insists on serving without a salary, but Lee is giving up his pension to do this. I mean, he's not going to collect a pension from the British government while he's leading an army against British troops. So he gives up his pension, but he wants Congress to make good on it, which Congress does. It takes actually some days for Lee to negotiate the terms of his salary with the Congress. And then Lee and Washington set off for Cambridge to take command of the army. When they reach New York, a dispatch arrives from Boston. Actually, they reach New York at the same time General Clinton, the British general, is passing through New York. They don't see each other, but some of the same people greet each one as they're making their way through New York. And a dispatch arrives in New York from Boston on its way to Congress. Washington opens it, and it's news of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And Washington thinks that what we need to do is have another big battle like this. Remember, if you're a general, what you want to do is have a big battle. And he says that will convince the British public to give up the war. So Washington hopes for another big battle like Bunker Hill. He'd also heard really glowing things about New England troops from John Adams and others, that the New Englanders are all fierce as lions, ready to fight, great soldiers. Washington gets here, and this isn't what he experiences. He can't believe these people, the New Englanders. They're all dirty. They never bathe. In fact, they have a phobia about bathing. They don't listen to orders. And in fact, and every man thinks he is just as good as every other man. And why should anyone give me orders? In fact, in the New England militia, the men elect their officers. And if you're an officer and you tend to give men orders they don't like, they're going to elect someone else. And their camps are dirty. They don't dig latrines, which means the area around Harvard is filthy because these men, remember, we don't know how many there are, relieve themselves wherever they feel like it. They feel like they've been on kind of a holiday, with some fighting going on. But another problem is, too, there are a lot of problems with these New England troops. One is, they're all paid by their province or by their colony. In Massachusetts, the troops are paid they're paid every month. So that means some are paid on the first of the month. Some are paid on the last of the month. Massachusetts troops are paid with the new moon every month. So that means if you're from Rhode Island, you got paid on the first of the month. How come the guys from Massachusetts are getting paid now? That's going to cause some friction. And also, a lot of guys have arrived at the camp, people have arrived at the camp knowing here you have big groups of young men hanging out with nothing to do. This would be a good place to go and sell liquor. And so you have these young guys hanging out, drinking too much, and plus, for a form of recreation, they like to fire off their guns. This is really a terrible place. Washington also says none of them is conscious of any danger until someone's pointing a bayonet into their breast. And this isn't really going to become an army, he doesn't think. A couple of the New Englanders do impress him, and one is this man, Nathaniel Greene, who is from Rhode Island. And Greene and his forces are camping in Roxbury. And what really impresses Washington about Greene is that Greene's men have dug really good latrines. His camp is immaculate. And so Washington immediately had Greene transferred nearer to his headquarters in Cambridge. And the other is this guy, Henry Knox, who then was about 24 years old. And Knox, who wasn't even in the army, had built as a volunteer a fort at Roxbury on the high ground. And Washington saw, here's a guy who understands how to build a fort. And meanwhile, Washington has other problems with the army. Knox had run a bookstore in Boston before the war, which did have a lot of books on military science and other things. And Washington realizes that in order to get the British out of Boston, he is going to need artillery. And of course, the problem is there isn't any artillery handy. So Washington puts Knox in charge of an expedition to go to Fort Ticonderoga at Lake Champlain. This had been the largest British fortification in North America. And it was built during the wars between the French and the British. And then after 1763, when the British pretty much controlled North America, there was no longer a reason to have a big battery there. There still are a lot of cannon there, but a very small garrison. And in May of 1775, at about the same time as we had the battle at Noddle's Island, an expedition from Vermont had gone up to Fort Ticonderoga to capture the weapons. And an American general named Benedict Arnold realized that if the weapons fell into the hands of the Vermonters, that would be the last we would see of any of them, because the Vermonters wanted the weapons to use against the New Yorkers who claimed Vermont. So Arnold and Ethan Allen, the Vermonter, had captured the fort, and up there Washington knew are about 80 pieces of heavy artillery. So he makes to Henry Knox kind of a good news, bad news proposition. the good news is Washington wants Knox to be in charge of all of the artillery in the Continental Army. The bad news is Knox has to go out to Lake Champlain and get the artillery. And Knox and his brother Michael set out for Fort Ticonderoga, which is 300 miles from Boston. They set out in December and they build sleds and they hire teamsters with teams of oxen to haul these cannon over the mountains. That is down along the Hudson River and then through the Berkshires. And by January, yes.
That's Route 9, right?
Roughly Route 9, yeah. There wasn't a Route 9 then.
Well, yeah, but yeah, like Route 9 goes through my town, and there's like a little.
What's the town?
Spencer.
Yeah, because Knox, let me see, I have a,
The middle school, my school district is called Knox Trail.
yeah, because in the 1920s, New York and Massachusetts marked the trail. So on the New York side, you see markers like this. Oh, I've stopped sharing. My apologies. I'm going to try to, and so they marked the trail. Oh, I'll show you this. All along the Massachusetts side, you have the New York side are markers like this. The Massachusetts side, are markers like this. So that's what you would see in Spencer, roughly every 6 miles or so, which is about how far they would get in a day. And they would come to a town like Spencer and they would fire the cannon so everyone could see them. This was a huge event. In fact, it was such an important event that 150 years later, as I said, New York and Massachusetts marked this, and it's the first historical trail marked in the United States, as Henry Knox had delivered these cannon to, he gets to Framingham by February, and then he rides off to Cambridge to tell Washington that he has the cannon, and then, thanks for telling us that. A couple of years ago, we brought, one of the cannons actually fell through the ice and didn't make it. It was hauled out later on, and so we brought it to South Boston a couple of years ago. But what happens then is Washington, who is here in Cambridge, has some of the cannon placed here at Lechmere Point and has them firing. Also around here is Fort Washington. You can still see this in Cambridge. And they're firing, by the way, they're not firing that much because another thing Washington had learned during the summer of 1775, he had come here thinking these guys are ready to fight. And he gets here and they're really not ready to do anything other than fire off their guns and have a good time. And he is, Washington, and don't mean to spend that much time talking about Washington. One of Washington's real achievements was he had an explosive temper, but through the course of his life, he managed to control it, managed to control himself. And there are just maybe 2 or 3 episodes known to us where Washington lost his temper. And one was shortly after arriving in Cambridge. He couldn't find out how many men were under his command. First thing he wanted to know, how many men do we have? No one could tell him. And another problem he had, I mentioned the troops getting paid on different days. Connecticut, a regiment has 900 men. In Massachusetts, a regiment has 1,100, although sometimes it has 1,000. Rhode Island, a regiment is about 1,000 men. So Washington thinks, well, why don't we just take 100 men from this Massachusetts regiment and send them to a Connecticut regiment? You can't do that because these men are from Massachusetts and these men are from Connecticut. Well, how about 100 men from a Massachusetts regiment, send them to another Massachusetts regiment? You can't do that either because these guys had agreed to serve under Seth. These guys had agreed to serve under Henry. Your guys don't want to serve under him. So you can't do that. And it takes him weeks to find out how many men there are. Every day there's a different reason. We couldn't quite figure out today how many people we actually have in camp. You can imagine how frustrating this is. And then one day someone brings him this piece of news. Do you remember when you arrived and you wanted to know how much gunpowder we had? And we said we had 300 barrels of gunpowder. Well, it turns out we forgot to subtract what we had fired at Bunker Hill. We have 30 barrels. That's enough for each man to fire his weapon 9 times. At that moment, probably, Washington could hear men over in the camp firing off their guns just because it was a fun thing to do. And it was at this moment that Washington had everyone leave the room except for his secretary, Joseph Reed. And Washington then, once the door was closed, spent half an hour swearing about this position he had gotten himself into. He couldn't believe he had put himself in this position, and he used words that Reed did not know existed, expressing his displeasure with this situation and these men he's supposed to turn into soldiers. Now, Washington was really someone people came to see. Abigail Adams and a group of other women came to see Washington. And in fact, John Adams had written to Abigail about what a great general Washington was. And as these ladies are riding in their carriage along the Charles River to enter Cambridge, there is a small bridge here, the only bridge over the river. And there still is a bridge at that site. And it's a hot day in August. And what do these women see as they're crossing the bridge? A lot of Washington soldiers climbing up onto the bridge and diving into the water below. And you would think, well, that's pretty harmless, except of course, they're doing this naked. These women see these naked soldiers running around on the bridge, diving into the water, and Washington for months has been telling these guys to clean up. Why don't they bathe? And now suddenly they've taken to bathing, but in the middle of the day, when you have, as Washington said, the finest ladies in the area crossing the bridge. And these are people who don't have any sense. And Washington doesn't know if they will ever get any. So this is yet another problem for Washington. Meanwhile, we have Henry Knox arriving with the cannon, and Washington has some of them placed at Lechmere Point, some at Fort Washington, to fire at Boston. And this is being done for a couple of reasons. One is to make the British think that Washington is preparing to bring his men from Cambridge across the Back Bay and the Charles River, which had frozen, and attack from that side. The other thing is to make a lot of noise, because down here in Roxbury, at the headquarters of General Thomas, the cannon have been delivered this way to Thomas, and he is going to bring them over here to Dorchester Neck, to Dorchester Heights, in what is today South Boston. And on the 4th of March, General Thomas and about 700 men bring these pieces of artillery to Dorchester Neck. And on the morning of March the 5th, General Howe sees that the heights, this is actually the highest point south of the town, now have a gun emplacement. Some of them are guns, some of them are logs painted black to look like guns. Now, remember, the previous year, the Americans had dug in at Bunker Hill overnight. That was in June. This is March. The ground is pretty much frozen. They wouldn't be able to dig, but in Dorchester and Roxbury, they had cut down a lot of trees to make fascines, chandeliers, other kinds of fortifications, which they then hauled to the top of the hill, filled with rocks, and placed guns on top of them. And now they probably could get a few shots into Boston, but the real target would be the British fleet out here in the harbor and the British fortification on Castle Island. And Washington comes out to inspect on the 5th of March, and he asks if these men of Boston will allow the British to triumph on the 5th of March. What's the 5th of March? Why would that be a bad day to allow the British to triumph? Was there an event of particular importance to the people of Boston? The Boston Massacre. They remembered the date. Washington remembered the date. And then Washington also knew the British will try to attack the Heights. And his plan was, when the British leave Boston to go and attack Dorchester Heights, he will then leave Cambridge and go and take Boston. But neither of these things happens, because as the British are in their boats going to try to storm the Heights, and by the way, this is a much steeper hill than Bunker Hill, and the fortifications are much closer to the water. So it would have gone very badly for the British. A big storm blows up. Excuse me, the British can't land. Washington can't attack. And this gives the Americans more time to put fortifications here and here. And then a few days later, the chairman of Boston's Board of Selectmen appears here at Boston Neck. The British have fortified the neck here and here, and this is kind of a no man's land between. And this chairman of the Board of Selectmen comes to the neck, and he has a message for Washington that he says he had heard General Howe say that if Washington won't hinder the British as they are leaving, the British won't burn Boston on their way out of town. Washington knows this is not an official communication, but it's an indication that the British are preparing to leave. And over the next few days, Washington and his men watch as the British load their ships in the harbor. And also the British in Boston are stealing just about everything they can, loading their ships. They also have to take out, in addition to their soldiers and sailors, 1,100 loyalists who don't want to stay as Washington and the Massachusetts government retake Boston. And this takes them about 2 weeks. But on the 17th of March of 1776, the British evacuate Boston, which is why tomorrow is Evacuation Day in the city of Boston. It's been a legal holiday now for more than a century, Evacuation Day, which also coincidentally is St. Patrick's Day. And as Boston became a predominantly Irish Catholic city, actually there was a St. Patrick's Day parade in the 1870s. The Evacuation Day parade started in 1901 when the monument at Dorchester Heights was built. This is the first American victory in the War for Independence. And this is the painting that Gilbert Stuart did of Washington at Dorchester Heights that hangs in Faneuil Hall. Here is General Thomas at his headquarters in Roxbury. And Congress commissioned a gold medal for Washington that says, Postibus primo fugatus, which means what? It's Latin.
Does primo mean like first?
Primo is first, that's one, yes. Postibus.
Have something to do with humans?
Yeah, but not strictly humans, a certain kind of humans. Think of other words that have H-O-S-T, like hostile or hostilities. B-U-S is the plural in Latin. Yeah, enemies, very good. First, enemies. Fugatus is the verb. What? No. Kind of, to flight or to flee. So the enemies first made to flee, okay? And here you see Washington and the cannon, the British fleet leaving as Boston then the British troops evacuate Boston. And Washington has General Ward, who is the chief military officer from Massachusetts, go into the town after the British had evacuated. And by the way, in Washington's camp that week, the sentries would challenge anyone coming in. Every day they would challenge, and every day there would be a new challenge and countersign, because you didn't want someone to know the sign from yesterday and then be able to sneak into the camp. And on this day, the challenge word was Boston. So the sentry will say Boston if you're trying to get into Washington's camp. If you should be going into Washington's camp, you will know the countersign. And on March 17th of 1776, does anyone know what the countersign was? It was St. Patrick. Exact. How did you know that, Seth?
Because you said it last Thursday.
Was I talking about this last Thursday?
Yeah, a little bit.
Oh, when we went to the watch. Thank you. Well, that's a good memory. Good. So this, of course, is the statue in the public garden of Washington, first to put the enemy to flight. And this is the monument at Dorchester Heights in South Boston as we commemorate the first American victory in the War for Independence. Okay, any questions? So this is tomorrow. There are some activities. Usually there are more activities for St. Patrick's Day or Evacuation Day. I'll send you some things that may be happening of interest to you. And are there any other questions, things you want to know about? There's not a parade this year. There probably will be next year. There wasn't one last year. It's the largest parade in Boston. And there are other activities. In fact, the entire month of March is in South Boston dedicated to Evacuation Day. So it hasn't been this year, last year. There will be a wreath laying at 10 o'clock. The park, there's been a couple of videos made this year that I will send you to tell you the story, and also about how St. Patrick's Day and Evacuation Day also became a big political day with a breakfast preceding the parade. So March 17th, you all now know, is Evacuation Day in Boston, and don't let anyone tell you different. Okay. Well, I could go on, but I think I will let you take a break. We'll consider it a holiday, and I'll see you on Thursday. And tell you
Sounds
what.
good. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana. Good to see you.
Thank
You too.
you.
Take care. Bye, Amber.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care, Kathy. Good to see you. Nice
Safe.
picture, brother.
Thank you.